In this episode, a new semi-regular segment on the channel. I'm calling it, working title, Official Misinformation, because our government keeps telling us that we need protecting from misinformation, while at the same time, they are the nation's leading producer of it. And we need this protection because we're all obviously children and can't possibly be trusted with uncensored internet access, clearly. Today, the Prime Minister in his misinformational position stated just last week on violence against women. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, new cars cheap but Australia only, website, card. Now, fair warning, okay? No automotive content in this one, and the jokes are going to be thin and few on the ground, right? By virtue of the nature of this confronting subject.
Prime Minister has declared domestic violence a national crisis.
Incidentally, I just checked, okay? I am still a man, notionally. I got independent verification, which was quite the relief. I'm a white, 60-year-old male. So, pretty much right in the feminist crosshairs here. Kevlar vest, here we come.
He's now ordered an emergency meeting of National Cabinet to address the sickening rise in domestic murders across the country.
Sickening rise in domestic violence, really. There's no long-term evidence for this. In fact, society has never been safer in Australia. Individual instances of violence are obviously horrific at times, and they're always regrettable if there's an alternative. But society is safe, and it's getting safer for everyone. In a population of 27 million people, all kinds of violence is going to occur, and you can pretty much cherry-pick horrific incidents if you like, which is, of course, what the mainstream media does to make its content compelling. We men are all expected to feel somehow guilty by association, like, you toxic bastard. Collective guilt based on nothing but your chromosomes. I am dead set sick of this. This repulsive news report and the hysteria in it is simply not what the official data shows. Up front, however, let me speak for average dudes presumptuously by saying that if you are a man and you are violent to women, you are both a scumbag and a criminal. It really is that simple. Everyone I know thinks that. But if you are in the vast majority of men who are not committing these crimes and have no intention to, you are in no way responsible for them.
We want the government to acknowledge that this is a national emergency.
This is not a national emergency. The reduction in so-called intimate partner homicide over the past 30 years is actually a triumph for our safe society, which is, of course, why nobody reports it. Everyone harks on about bias in the media, right? And having worked in it for 30 frickin' years, I can tell you that the three top biases affecting the mainstream media are not the biases you think they are. It's the predisposition to laziness, sensationalism, and conflict.
In Canberra, the march was to Parliament House, where the Prime Minister told the crowd,
"And this is a national crisis."
Slightly less shit, Scott Morrison is a clown. Personal opinion. His statements on this are complete misinformation. He's either an idiot or a bullshitter or both. The facts simply do not support this contention. He has a whole government department called the Australian Institute of Criminology, right? You, the taxpayer, you pay them to monitor homicide nationally. They've done this nationally since 1990. That's not all they do, obviously, but they have done it for 3 and a bit decades. It's more than 3 decades of hard national homicide data. And I think we can all agree that homicide is a pretty good barometer of violence in society generally. And this is in part because it's so easy to measure and the data is so reliable. Thanks to death being an absolute, and homicide is a legal thing, right? So there's a standard against which it is measured. There's no problem with the data, no fuzzy edges. Other kinds of violence are quite fuzzy around the edges when you drill down into the granular detail. Some people, for example, currently argue that words can be violent. But I would suggest that two people arguing about how to stack the freaking dishwasher is not worthy of inclusion into the data underpinning this debate. And it is quite difficult, for me at least, to see a society where violence is up but murder is way down. Homicide is a good way to track violence generally, I'd suggest. In any case, I think we can all agree that homicide is the worst form of one-on-one violence. If I were Albo, I probably would have consulted the government department whom I authorise to monitor all of this data before shooting from the frickin' hip and declaring an entirely good societal story a national crisis, thus doing the population a monumental disservice.
And this is a national crisis.
Just because people march in the street doesn't make it true. This is exactly the kind of epic misinformation that he claims to be against. According to the government's own Criminology Institute, for the past 3 decades, all homicide is down. For most of the 90s, homicide was running in the early 300s nationally every year. For the past decade, early 200s, that is total homicide in Australia. I'll put links to all of these data sets in the description so you can verify them at your leisure and see that I am not bullshitting you here. Now, this is a pretty solid reduction from 300s to 200s, great, but it's made even better when you consider that the population was only 17 million back in 1990 and it's more like 27 million now. Roughly 60% more people, but 30% less homicide. That's awesome. Well done, Australia. If you want to get real about this and compensate for the difference in population, to quantify it properly, you just take the number of homicides and you divide it by the number of people. Usually you do it by the number of 100,000 people to better manage the position of the decimal point, but it's the same thing. You get a properly comparable homicide rate. It's killed people per 100,000 in the population. And FYI, they also do this with the road death statistics so that you can compare, say, 1970, which was utterly terrible, to today, which is also a very good news story. So here it is, the Australian Institute of Criminology homicide rate, 1990 to 2021. Obviously, over on the right-hand edge of those curves, the pandemic really didn't help. People were stressed. But the long-term trend here is absolutely undeniable. 1.8 homicides per 100,000 people has fallen to 0.8 in 3 decades. That's a 56% reduction in the rate of homicides in this country. That's something I feel we should all be riffing air guitar over. Homicide deaths per 100,000 in America. 7.5, according to the Centres for Disease Control over there. 7.5 there, 0.8 here. That's almost 10 times higher in America. Almost 6 of those 7.5 homicides per 100,000 people are gun-related. So, dear America, gun control works, dudes. The freedom to bear arms is in the Constitution, but it's actually a freedom to be killed a lot more often. But frankly, even if you take the gun homicides out of the frame here, the American homicide rate is still roughly double ours. Overall, America is just a far more violent society.
We need to change the culture. We need to change attitudes.
No, we don't. Our culture is fine. And we could always do better, certainly. And there are individual abhorrent tragedies in any large population, obviously. But we already have a very safe society for both women and men. And it's getting safer. That is the clear, established, long-term trend. This is a fact. I would argue that the median man in Australia has nothing whatsoever to apologise for in respect of this bullshit cultural claim by the PM. We don't collectively conspire to murder our partners. I've never been invited to one of those meetings, and neither have you. You are now looking at the official graph from the government department that you pay to monitor all of this homicide data, detailing 3 decades of so-called intimate partner homicide broken down into female and male victims per 100,000 population. Female victims on the top, male victims below. Obviously, in an ideal world, nobody would ever die on the road or of misadventure or at work or at the hand of anyone else, intimate to them or otherwise. And every one of these deaths is individually a tragedy to someone, of course. But that's 3 decades of official data. Intimate partner homicide. There is only one conclusion, and I suspect that most morons could draw it after even a cursory look. But our PM is in a class of his own, unfortunately, seemingly. The most profound reduction is in female victims. That's pretty clear. In 3 decades, there has been a 75% reduction in the rate of being the female victim of intimate partner homicide. For male victims, it's about a 30% reduction, which is still quite positive. These numbers, they don't lie. There's no agenda. This is how our society has evolved. It is a trend that even a moron could see. We should also be riffing air fucking guitar about this, in my view. What a brilliant job we've done making intimate relationships 75% safer for women in 3 decades. We should always advocate to do better.
We've got our premiers saying they'll review bail laws. Why the hell did you let him out?
If a violent offender is out on bail and commits homicide, for example, perhaps we should investigate how bail works. I'd argue for that, rather than attempt to collectively fuck over all men just because of their chromosomes by association. This is simply not what a national crisis looks like. This is what under control and getting better looks like. Can we just take a moment to acknowledge and congratulate ourselves as a nation, as a society, collectively, for the fucking awesome job we've done, in particular for women, reducing the incidence of domestic partner homicide? Because that's the truth. I also find it confusing that nobody seems all that worked up about the male victims of intimate partner homicide, do they? That would be roughly 1/4 of all intimate partner homicides. That's the bottom line of this graph, which everyone turns a blind eye to. For the past 10 years, roughly one man gets killed by his intimate partner for every 3-ish women who are killed by their partners. Nobody appears to give 2 shits about the dudes who are getting popped by their partners. And 25% is a significant fraction, in my view. You could look at it like an opportunity to be worked on. Are male victims somehow worth less than female victims on this one? I think perhaps they are in real terms, as valued by our society in ambient terms, whatever, generally. This does not seem all that equitable or inclusive or fair, at least not to me.
It's not just government's problem. It's a problem of our entire society.
According to the Institute of Criminology, for the 2020 to 2021 financial year, when a woman commits homicide and a man is the victim, that woman is, in 42% of cases, killing her intimate partner. Don't take this out of context. This is off a low numeric base. We're talking about the proportionality of the victims to the offenders. Every other relationship category where the victim is a child, a father, some other family member, acquaintance or a stranger is substantially less when a woman is the offender. When a woman kills a man, the number one relationship to that man is intimate partner by a long shot. This is the official data and it is publicly available. And it's broadly the same with men killing women, sadly. 49% of the time when a man kills a woman in Australia, it's an intimate partner who falls a victim. Male-on-male homicides, unsurprisingly, tend to be overwhelmingly committed against acquaintances or strangers. Women offenders are also somewhat predisposed, at least in percentage terms, to kill their children. Female-on-female homicide is sadly 42% committed against their daughters. This is when a woman kills a woman. The number one victim category is daughter. This is the biggest category of female-on-female homicide. As a proportion of total homicides committed by men, men don't actually kill their children all that often. 2.8% for sons as victims and 3.9% for daughters. Perhaps we should, therefore, on the basis of all of these data and in the interests of equality, we should also call on women collectively to change their attitude and their culture and stop this epidemic of intimate violence against men and children. Now, if society is to trend ever safer, this is going to have to occur. The data clearly demonstrates this. Otherwise, we are going to be missing a significant opportunity to do better just for the sake of political correctness.
Good evening. The Prime Minister has joined tens of thousands of people demanding an end to domestic violence against women.
Men are also overwhelmingly the biggest category of overall homicide victim. If you're a dude, you are just far more likely to die by homicide. This is a fact. And personally, I would find it very interesting to learn how many of the male victims of homicide were protecting their partner or their children when they got recalled to the factory.
That's fine. I respect the organisers' right to do that.
That's a full-out lie.
We need to change the culture. We need to change attitudes.
Anthony Albanese calling a snap meeting of premiers after declaring it a national crisis.
Now that is frankly one of the biggest loads of disingenuous, vote-grabbing, misinformational horse shit I have ever heard from a Prime Minister, personal opinion. On the basis of this and numerous other recent zero-integrity political stunts, I welcome the government's misinformation legislation, right? Because when it passes, one of the first people who will have to be cancelled is Anthony Albanese over comments such as these, which to me at least are indefensible. Why misinform the Australian people, Prime Minister, when you've got the Australian Institute of Criminology on speed dial, metaphorically, with the true facts of the matter close at hand, with the hard evidence that our society is in fact safe and getting safer for pretty much everyone, except the Indigenous, of course. According to the Institute, homicide is still, sadly, pretty much out of control in Indigenous communities. Certainly in relative terms, it is atrociously high. If only the money wasted on the referendum had been tipped into countermeasures that were effective there. If you're an average man in Australia and this endless campaigning against all men is bringing you down, the implication that you are somehow a cog in a giant wheel of alleged cultural male violence, I get why this gets you down. It's very confronting to be thought of in this way by a big slice of the population. But you need to realise that you are not, in fact, even a tiny part of this problem. You're just not. There is nothing, like absolutely nothing, for you to feel guilty about. Your chromosomes, your wedding vegetables, you being a dude intrinsically does not land you in a collective pool of guilt or responsibility over this. It just emphatically does not. Feminists alleging otherwise are simply wrong about this. Let's be kind. There is no collective male responsibility, however much this bullshit concept appeals to feminists, politicians, and of course the media. It's all just soundbite horse shit. If an offender commits a crime, any crime, but let's pretend it's an act of violence, it is them and solely them who is responsible for that act. This is a very simple concept. The responsibility for the small, lingering number of intimate partner homicides suffered by both women and men rests solely with the very small number of scumbags who commit these crimes. If you are a woman who sees this stuff, these marches in the street, and you are terrified to go out at night or something, I would argue that the PM, the mainstream media, and the sisterhood is doing you a gross disservice. Australia is one of the safest countries in which you can live your life. I would also argue that it's a good idea always to do risk management, in public, at home, whatever. Don't kick over a row of Harleys outside the Sons of Anarchy clubhouse. It's a bad idea. Don't make a stand over your frickin' wallet or your handbag if a druggie with a knife requests it with a certain vengeful, unhinged gleam in their eye. And above all else, try to be kind of nice to the people you live with and perhaps even give them the benefit of the doubt. Dig deep if they act unreasonably from time to time, because everyone does that. But if you see a plate of frickin' death cap mushrooms on the kitchen bench, run. If I were the PM's advisor, I would simply say, sotto voce, listen here, dipshit. Men are half of the population, they also vote. Why alienate them with these inflammatory, untrue misinformation sound bites?